We're here today wanting to hear about what God is doing in not just Zug, not just Switzerland, but across the continent of Europe. And I know that it's a big place, but want to hear from you guys about what is the, as we've said, spiritual temperature.
I think the spiritual temperature in Europe is a very interesting one because of after COVID, you had the war that broke out in Ukraine. That has actually added some dynamics to Europe, which is very interesting. But for our church, it's actually given us a little bit more breadth, as many of the Ukrainians are finding their ways into churches, and they certainly have done that at Lift. So we're excited that as a church, we could see a lot of Europeans coming in, and that's one of the strengths of our church, is that somehow, in a most wonderful way, people find their ways weekly into our church from something like 35, 40 different nations.
Before we came to Europe, we were told that Europe is the graveyard of churches. That's what we heard. And that's what we kind of expected going in, that it was going to be really tough. And we say now that we've seen more salvations in Europe than we ever saw in South Africa. There's just an atmosphere within our context in Zug where people are finding Jesus. And regularly on a Sunday, people are putting their faith in Jesus from all different nations that they come from. And it's been the most surprising thing. But I think God has surprised us with showing us that the temperature is a little bit higher than what we may have thought it was. People are wanting reality. They're wanting truth in today's age.
You know, Peet mentioned just the post-Christian nature of Europe, and there's a temptation to just kind of throw your hands up. You guys didn't do that. You came from Africa, actually in South Africa, where the gospel was going forward, and then you moved. You've been in ministry for decades. You've been in two very different contexts. What are the things you would say are unique about what's happening in Switzerland?
The one unchanging factor between South Africa and Europe is the gospel. The gospel is steady. The gospel is powerful. And what we have seen both in South Africa, but also in Europe, and I think everywhere else, is that God uses ordinary people like us to do extraordinary things because we believe in an extraordinary God. And we're so glad about that because we're so ordinary. And what we do at Lift is so ordinary. Eric, that gives us hope for Europe. Africa was always termed the forgotten continent. And I think Europe has been termed that now, the forgotten continent. And of course, we've got history that is such a stronghold on Europe. And that history is obviously church/religion centered.
You guys have been there, is it 9 years?
9 years.
Have you seen, certainly, obviously I've got COVID right in the middle of that, but what have you seen in the arc of things in terms of what God is doing, how the temperature might be rising even over the course of that short period of time?
We saw in the beginning a lot of expats from different nations coming in. And our new membership evenings, the dinners that we have, was filled with expats. The last intake that we had within the church, the majority of the people were Swiss people. Because God knows that He needs stable churches through which the gospel needs to flow out into Europe. He's sending us some Swiss people who can form a little bit more of a foundation for us. And Eric, I really do believe that Europe's hope is through more and more churches that are established in Europe, that is gospel-centered. And I would love to see the Swiss be a strong force for us as we, take hands with the rest of the world, the rest of the advanced family, to see that become a reality in Europe.
One of the things we started a few years ago within our context was a ladies' and children's boutique shop, clothing store. It's situated at the church. And we also added on a coffee shop to that. So its purpose was to raise funds for vulnerable children in the world. But what we didn't see is that God had another purpose for it, and that was it was going to be an evangelistic arm. So over the years, as we've become known to the community, many ladies on a weekly basis come in that are not part of the church. And through that, ladies are coming to know Jesus, and they're coming into the church and they're bringing their families. So the temperature is rising through a means that is so simple. It's shopping and it's having coffee. But we form relationship with these ladies, and soon the gospel gets spoken to them. And since the war in Ukraine, Switzerland has opened up its arms to many of the Ukrainians. So on a weekly basis, we have about 30 Ukrainian ladies with their children come in, and we offer them clothes for free because we want them to have dignity when they're needing to rebuild their lives. We are seeing the temperature rise through just relationships and friendships, and showing people in Europe that there is a God in heaven who loves them.
Around the world, we know what's going on in Ukraine, but you guys are living very close to it. And it sounds to me like in crisis, there has been opportunity. As you look around, can you just describe a little bit more about how you've seen that happening, how it might be a door for the gospel in light of what's happening in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think for our church, it's been an opportunity. We're used to resource into areas that we've known over the years, but we've never resourced ourselves into Ukraine. And our church rose to the challenge to give, and we gave over 50,000 francs into the cause of the Ukrainians. So I think they have helped us to be more effective. They're amazing people in the sense that Christianity is strong in the Ukraine. And so many of them are looking for places for worship. And I think Switzerland in particularly is so strategic in how they help these people.
If you can imagine 5-10 years from now, looking back, what would you hope to see in another 5 to 10 years in Europe that would just blow your mind, but that God can do?
We had a man in our church who had a dream about our church and Europe. And at that time, he wasn't a believer, and a very good friend of ours, Swiss man. He saw lift churches, and that was his language, because he doesn't have any spiritual language that he could put his thoughts on. But he said he saw lift churches all over Europe started, but that there would be a massive involvement and a multiplication of churches within Europe. And so within the next 10 years, my faith isn't there to see all of that happen, but I would be amazed to answer your question when I see that, because at the moment it looks like this is just an impossible task. Certainly for us where I sit and for us as a church. But I know that as we partner with like-minded churches around the world, and we put our faith together, our resources together, that can become a reality.
I think that is something that is always on our hearts. We're praying for, we're wanting for, is we need to see more relevant churches planted in Europe. There are so few, and we really do need help. You know, we are always praying for more laborers, firstly to come to us and help us with what God's doing. We need help, but we need help in Europe. And so I'm continually praying for God to stir up people's hearts around the world and send them to Europe, church planters to Europe. We need help to do what God is wanting to do.
And we as a church need help. It's an established church. We've been so privileged just to be placed there. But as people listen to us today, I hope that God would stir upon some people's hearts to say, maybe we can relocate to Zug and help the teams there to become more effective so that we can reach out. For me, that's probably our number one need, is to have people who would say, God has placed Europe on our hearts. We want to come and we want to do it. So Jenny is absolutely right. We're realizing that we're at a place where we need more help, but we need more help on the ground. And so it's personally for Lift, but also for other churches to be established.